that. So, thank you all for coming to what happens to be the last luncheon of the semester. And let me tell you right from the start that when Dr. Halpern, when Stu suggested the idea that the Strauss Center and the honors program, who work together in many things, do this event, I jumped at the idea. Having back some people who have been associated with both programs here was a pleasure. My only concern was, well, December 16, the end of the semester, students are, in the middle of almost finals, last classes, last papers, who will come? So this teaches us a lesson that when we have people here we appreciate, people respond, so I am very glad that you made time for this. And it's a great honor and privilege to have here two people who were so central to our institution, particularly to our program. Still, I use as examples the thesis that both of you wrote for the honors program. When students ask me about Jewish studies and doing a thesis in Jewish studies, because both Ari and Shlomo did what I would say masterpieces. So I'm glad that one of your mentors is here, so that makes me very happy. And this shows once again the title of this event couldn't be more appropriate. We say the tension between the Beit Midrash and academy. Here is where, in some sense, where they come together. So I don't want to put more delay, because one of the places where there is tension between the Beit Midrash and the academy is that people show up here very easily, but very eagerly, but you see that 2 minutes before 1 p.m. they will leave you very eagerly as well. So, and that's the way it should be. So we are very glad that you guys are here, and we want to leave it a little bit up to you, how you want to organize yourselves, you want to speak, because this should be a dialogue between you, but between all of us. So at some point we'll open it for questions, but I'm sure you prepared a few things that you want to say. So it's your floor today.
All right.
I sit here.
Okay. First of all, thank you very much, Dr. Quilich, for that wonderful introduction. You're invited to speak at my funeral. It's
I'll make it up.
Yeah. It's. I'm sure I speak for Shlomo as well when I say it's incredibly humbling to be here, especially since so many of our teachers are here, and in my case, and I'm sure Shlomo would say the same, although he's here so he can speak for himself. Many people who are here, and not just professors of mine, but also colleagues or junior colleagues of mine, some of whom are in the room, taught me not just substantially speaking everything that I know, but also how to be virtuous and how to live a holistic, integrated religious life, and for that I'm truly grateful. If I guess you don't mind, I'll just pass these out. I don't know if there are enough. If there aren't, well, Dr. Bernstein warned me, but so I think conversations such as these often begin by noting and taking for granted a tension between the academy and the Beit Midrash, and there's much to be said for that. What Shlomo and I, when we or Rabbi Zuckier and I, when we planned to Kavod HaTorah, when we planned this out, we actually thought about this in reverse terms, in the complementarity between the Beit Midrash and the academy, and we thought about that in two different ways, and we'll each speak to one of these aspects. The first way that we thought about this is what can Orthodox Jewish scholars gain from the academy, not just in terms of their own personal religious growth, but also in terms of conversations that take place in the community more broadly. What particular things can we take from the academy in a truly positive sense, and also what unique contributions can, perhaps, other than an instrumental sense, what unique contributions can Orthodox Jewish scholars make to the academy? Both of us come from a background in, I suppose, what in the YC department would be called classical Jewish history. We both have ended up in fields that are, broadly speaking, within that ambit. What's interesting to me is that I think it was in think it was in an edition of Kol HaMavaser. It was after I worked for Kol HaMavaser, and I think it was during Rabbi Zuckier's tenure that there was an interview with David Berger, and Dr. Berger had mentioned in the course of that interview that he had thought for a time about going into classical Jewish history, and his mentor, Dr. Cohen, Gershon Cohen, had pushed him in that direction, and he had been reticent to do that and ultimately decided not to, as he describes in the interview, because of how challenging the field was for Orthodox Jews, both in terms of the kinds of questions that it asked, the attitudes that its adherents espoused, and so forth. So I think it's worthwhile reflecting now, several years later, both from Dr. Berger's time as a doctoral candidate or prospective doctoral candidate, and also from that interview about what it's like now in that particular field that back then was seen as an environment that was completely inhospitable to Orthodox life. I'd like to talk a little bit about what, first of all, some of what I'm working on, but also I think how this kind of work has stimulated me not just to think about problems that are germane to the field of Jewish studies or ancient Christianity more generally, but also to conversations that are intensely relevant in our communal life. So I prepared a little source sheet here. We won't have time to go through it in too much depth. So I've highlighted some quotes that I think are important. What I've been thinking about in the course of my recent work are different ways that the respective fields that make up sort of late antiquity are organized. So generally, in the kind of departments that I apply to, and for those of you who are thinking about going into this field that you'll apply to, are organized basically around what I would call substantive norms, which is to say, a substantive norm in legal terminology would be sorts of normative values, like do not kill, do not steal, love thy neighbors. These are things that we do, as opposed to procedural norms, which are the ways both that we know why those things are important, and also how to implement those things. So in other words, a procedural question would be, how do you know when somebody has been killed? How do you know that it's wrong to kill? Once somebody has killed somebody, how do you prosecute such a person? So our fields are, broadly speaking, organized around substantive norms. For example, emphasis on the importance of purity, laws of Tumah V'Tahara, emphasis on the centrality of Jesus Christ as an eschatological figure, whether in a messianic sense or later in a divine sense, and how that sort of trajectory develops. So the centrality of Jesus, the centrality of purity, the centrality of Sabbath laws, and that sort of thing. So in other words, what you would encounter in a modern religious studies department that focuses on our period is a Jewish studies department and a Christianity department, or something along those lines. And then separate from that would sort of be Roman culture and Zoroastrianism and so on and so forth. So the problem that we encounter, and that scholars have been debating for 150 years now, is how exactly do we justify these divisions? Because after all, for at least 400 years, if not longer, you can point to a mountain of evidence as problematizing these sorts of distinctions. So, for example, you can look in Syria and you can see the Pseudo-Clementine literature, which is Christian writings from about the 3rd century and preserved in the 4th century, where you'll see Christians polemicizing against Paul, first of all, or at least their understanding of Paul. And you'll see sentences like, "Those who claim the mantle of Jesus but don't accept the law of Moses are no Christian, are no followers of Jesus indeed." So in a sense, this kind of problematizes easy distinctions between Judaism and Christianity, and on the Jewish side, you can point to distinctions as well. So you can even point to, for example, Paul himself. Paul, at least in latest, I think, most convincing readings of Paul at no point advocates the abrogation of Jewish law per se. He advocates the position that Gentiles need not observe Jewish law in order to be considered valuable by God. So this is not a position that easily maps onto an either Jewish or Christian divide. So the division between Judaism, Jewish studies, and Christianity, Christian studies, is not such an easy division to make. And the question is how to overcome this problem, while at the same time recognizing that there's lots of evidence for sources that do make these sorts of clear-cut divisions between Jews on the one hand and Christians on the other. So the way that I've thought about things is that actually, if we focus so much on substantive norms, we actually miss at least 50% of the picture. If we don't focus on procedural norms, we're missing a large part of what made Second Temple Judaism, early sort of late antiquity, special. So what I'd like to do now is just run through a couple of procedural categories that I've come up with that I think are coherent, and that I think can inform some of the ways in which sort of a lot of these texts develop, and the ways in which they don't necessarily have to map on to easy distinctions between Judaism and Christianity. So take a look, for example, at the sources in source number 1. And we'll try to run through these quickly in the interest of time. The assumption long held in sort of fields that are interested in these kinds of texts, and Dr. Bernstein is with Shlomo Kaufman did a lot of very important work on this, and on this. I think Shlomo Kaufman did it for his YC thesis. Yeah.
Shlomo Kaufman's YC honors thesis.
Right. So that has actually become quite an important article in the field. So take note. The
article was separate. The poor guy couldn't include anything in the honors thesis he had written in the article.
Ah, okay. Well,
He's a doctor anyway today.
In any event, the right kind of doctor. Right. Okay. So in any event, the assumption, the working assumption has been that it makes sense to compare the Dead Sea Scrolls and, let's say, the rabbis, or if you want to eliminate sort of that problematic time gap, the Pharisees, on the assumption that they're on a continuum, Pharisees and rabbis. So the assumption has been that it's just natural to compare these two groups because they're interested in the same substantive concerns: purity, Shabbos, Tchum Shabbos, and so on and so forth. They're interested in lots of the same things. But note that the procedural methods by which they claim knowledge of such things have absolutely nothing to do with each other, and to a certain extent are completely mutually exclusive. So take a look. If you look at the sources in source number 1, so the bolded portion in source from 1, I've labeled 1QS. That's the community rule. Without going into a lot of detail, it's one of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Forgive me. The bolded portion. In order to act in compliance with all that has been revealed from age to age, and according to what the prophets have revealed through His Holy Spirit. The way that the community rule knows how to act and knows what its substantive norms are is not because it participated in some sort of system of derivation that's logically accessible to everybody, not because it was simply told so by, not simply because they were told so by their parents who didn't know either and whose parents told them, not because anything was revealed through a prophet per se, but because there's this sense that divine revelation, in some sense, is continually reoccurring. So people who interpret Scripture, and here it's important to recall that what is going on here is, if you look in the Hebrew, Midrash HaTorah is actual scriptural exegesis, is being done by some sort of progressive divine revelation. So the way that you know how to interpret the Torah is through divine revelation. So you'll find much the same thing, and actually emphasized even more in the source from Pesach Havakuk I've given you on the side. But in the interest of time, I'll just quickly run through the rest. The Pharisees, in contrast, and we have some sources, very few, but some, from the Mishnah on the Pharisees, but they're not contemporary with the Pharisees, so we can look at sources that were. Josephus is one, and Paul is another. So I've given you sources from each over here in source number 2. If you look at the way that the Pharisees know what their substantive norms are, so you take a look at Josephus. Josephus tells us the Pharisees passed on to the people certain ordinances from a succession of fathers. The way that it's described it is parados is rather ekpateron de adoches, from a chain of ancestors, which is to say that the reason the Pharisees know what to do, how to practice their substantive norms, is not because, at least we're not told here, not because they were being doresh batorah, or not because of anything that was nigleh eis be'eis, but rather because there's a chain of transmission. It's a model that works on the principle of authority rather than on an assumption about divine revelation or scriptural exegesis and so forth. It doesn't mean that the Pharisees weren't doing scriptural exegesis. It just means that they weren't presenting that as their procedural justification. If you look in Paul, you'll see the same thing. Paul, when he's explaining his current iteration as an apostle to the Gentiles, he says, "I did not receive it from a human source." His gospel. "I did not receive it from a human source, nor was I taught it." And later he characterizes that teaching as traditions of my fathers. So Paul is essentially saying that What I know not because I'm Pharisee, not because it was just told to me by somebody, not because it's a tradition, but because it's been revealed to me through an apocalypsis, or some sort of revelation. Okay, so we have two different models here. One is revelation, one is authority. And in fact, if you look at the sources on the next page, I'll take another 2 minutes and we'll just maybe summarize them. So if you look in source number three, I've given you sources from Paul just as contrast, but the important one I want to focus on is the Book of Revelation. The Book of Revelation is interesting. I teach it at my shul.
Can you give us some context that explain it's an Orthodox shul?
So you can look on YU Torah, whenever I've used the Book of Revelation in the context of my shul, what I usually do as an exercise is I'll just read a passage from Revelation, and I'll ask, without saying what it is, and I'll ask people to guess where it's from. You can do this with Jews and Christians with the same, pretty much the same. You can do it with the same result, unless they know the Book of Revelation very well, which is not usually the case. The guesses will range from Yeshayahu to Sefer Daniel, and if they're really clever Balabatim, it'll Ben Sira. No one will guess Revelation or anything in the New Testament, precisely because if you read the Book of Revelation, there's nothing that would hint to anybody other than the fact that you know that it comes to be included quite late in the New Testament that tells you it's Christian work. So the Book of Revelation sees itself in straightforward continuity with the legacy of Am Yisrael, and it just simply makes a point about what it thinks is right and correct action. The way it justifies what it knows to be right and correct action is by calling its message the words of prophecy, and it describes the revelation that John of Patmos, presumably the author of Revelation, receives as a prophecy. The word prophecy or words for prophecy are used in the New Testament something like 20 times. Almost all of those, and out of those 20, I think 13, I believe, are in Revelation alone, and the other 7 are usually in Paul in ways that are derogatory. In other words, to minimize their importance. Revelation is clearly sold on the value of prophecy of divine revelation. This fits much better in terms of its prehistory, with what we find in Qumran than we find anywhere else. So it's worthwhile thinking about not Judaism and Christianity that emerged from the Second Temple, but different ways of procedures that come out of the Second Temple. There's the divine revelation procedure, and you could find that in the Dead Sea Scrolls. You can find that in the Book of Revelation, Ascension of Isaiah. You could find that in a bunch of other works. And there's the authority model. The authority model finds its most natural conclusion, first of all, in the Mishnah, not in the Midrash Halacha, but certainly in the Mishnah. But it also finds a quite natural expression in the works of Ignatius. Take a look at the last sources here. Ignatius is the bishop of Antioch. And the one thing Ignatius hates more than anything else is Midrash. So in the passage here, he says, "For I heard some saying," in other words, he presents his model of what people should be doing with their lives. He says, "I heard some saying, if I do not find it in the ancient records, I do not believe in the gospel. And when I said to them, it is written, Hatagegraptai, which means, in other words, I can provide you with sources. They say, that's just the question, right? They say, in other words, yeah, but you can make verses say anything. In other words, you can read a pasuk and you can make it say anything you want, right? If you ever felt in 8th grade, 9th grade, that this is what was going on in Gemara Shir. So hopefully we've all matured since then, but you can sympathize with Ignatius's readers, right? So Ignatius basically comes down with the following conclusion. You look at that last source. He says, all who belong, and he does it in the source I've just given you as well. But he says, for all who belong to God and Jesus are with the bishop, and all those who come into the unity of the church through repentance will belong to God, so that they may live according to Jesus Christ. In other words, Ignatius just says the way that you know what your substantive norms are is you listen to the bishops, whom he compares to the apostles. Right? You listen to the people who told you what to do. How do they know what to do? So Ignatius says, well, they listened to their bishop, and their bishop before them, and their bishop before them, all the way back. Kibbutz Torah, you can do the analogy yourself. Fine. So the point is that a couple of models come through, procedural models come through the Second Temple period, and they find their expression for hundreds of years afterwards. You can come up, I'm working now with about 6 or 7 different models. And you can think about the legacy of Bayesheni, not just in terms of substantive norms that come out of it, but also procedural norms. The legacy that we work with is the legacy of, and this is where I think the Beit Midrash has an impact on what I think about contemporary debates. The Beit Midrash, what the Academy tells me when you look at all these sources is that it's not useful just to organize the legacy of Bayesheni in terms of what people do, in terms of practice, praxis, whether you keep Tumah V'Tara, whether you keep mitzvos, whether you build Erevin or what have you. But also, what's important is the process that you espouse, the process that the Pharisees espouse, and that finds its expression, its greatest expression, in the Mishnah, particularly in Avos, Maseches Chagiga, is an authority model. You can figure out what the Midrash Halakha is doing, perhaps a little bit different, but I think it's important to emphasize that process is just as important as praxis. And in the context, I think, of contemporary debates, ranging from Geiros to women's issues to what have you, I think this is something that resonates in a very basic sense. And we could spend hours and hours and hours talking about this, but there's someone to the right of me who has much more interesting things to say, so I'll hand it over now to Rabbi Zuckier.
Thanks so much, Ari. That was really great. I'm just going to hand out these sheets if I want. Here, do get one.
Nice. Oh, I'm sorry.
I wanted to first echo everything Ari said in terms of this being certainly a humbling experience, and also to express Hakaras Hatov to various mentors. Dr. Holtz, who's here, was my advisor for my thesis, and Dr. Bernstein and Ray Carmi. I both took many honors courses with them and had many sessions just talking with them about, as Ari said, how to live the virtuous life, how to live the life of live the life where you're rooted in the Beit Midrash, even as you're functioning within the academy in various ways, and I appreciate that very much. And I still talk to them all the time, and also both to Dr. Halpern and Dr. Quilich, who are continuing their work, running wonderful programs and supporting student life here. So really, all around, thank you. And my goal is going to try to be to look at how a Beit Midrash background can contribute something where the academy had it lacking. For those of you who know what I'm studying and writing on, I'm planning on writing a thesis on Kudshim, issues related to sacrifice in rabbinic literature. And you may be surprised to know that, or maybe not, that field is not so developed within the academy. The area of Kudshim is not so developed. And we can demonstrate that in a few ways, but more importantly, we'll try to account for why that's the case and why it's precisely someone who learned Kudshim with people like Rav Lichtenstein, Rav Wolf in the Gush, and people like Rav Rosenzweig here. Someone like that might be better suited for entering the field. So just the first source here. Why doesn't everyone take a look at the first source if you haven't seen it on my Facebook feed? For those who are seeing it the first time, does someone want to just point to what's problematic about this first source? If anyone hasn't seen it on my... Sorry? Dr. Holtz, yes. Right, to read the quote, the rabbinic interest in the temple service, which exists in the Mishnah, he said, dissipates in the Amoraic period. Neither Talmud's has a Gemara for Kodashim. Right, and obviously, as we all know from looking at the Chasan Shas, whether or not we open it, there's stuff that's on Kudshim, right? There's all of Seder Kudshim, more or less, is treated by the Bavli. And this is Philip Alexander, an illustrious scholar, well known in what he probably calls ancient Judaism, and this mistake perpetuated itself. Not only was it written, it was published. This was published in a book. The editors let it through. So Kudshim has a little bit of a PR issue, at least from this source, but it's not this source. The truth is, there's never been a book-length study on any issue pertaining to sacrifice. Right? This is like, look at all of Masechah Zvachim. It's all about sacrifice. Several other Masechtos are too. There's no book-length study, no PhD thesis, nothing of the sort that deals with just those issues. So the question is, how did this happen? How did we get to the point where people are writing about all sorts of things, and there you can find a sugya that'll have definitely multiple articles, even multiple books written about it. But you have basically a quarter of rabbinic literature, the Kudshim issues. It comes out to about a quarter across all the different levels, Medrash Halacha, Tanaitic literature, Amoraic literature, where it's almost completely untreated. So I think for that, to understand this, you need to look back to the beginnings of academic Jewish studies, which, if you think about it, are Wissenschaft des Judentums, the movement in the 19th century in Germany, and before that, really the Reform movement. I think most people here probably already know about the Reform movements issues with animal sacrifice, with the Beis Hamikdash, with that whole time period. Number one, they named their synagogues temples. It's a replacement for the temple. Take a look at source number 2 here. This is another exciting one. Just keep note that it's assuming we don't apply Sefer Torah Sheksav Min, this is Shemos. So here it's right, that they say in Musaf, this is their Musaf. They changed Musaf so that it wouldn't talk about the carbon Musaf. It'd say that we hope to restore it. Right, that's all taken out. Instead of saying that, they say, well, hopefully our words will serve in place of the Karbanos, because we don't really want the Beis Hamikdash to come back. This is one of the changes to Reform liturgy. And if you look at their, looks like some of this got cut off, unfortunately, in the photocopy. But if you look at different statements made by David Einhorn, by the Philadelphia Platform, they see the destruction of the Second Temple, the Second Commonwealth, as they call it, not as a punishment for the sinfulness of Israel, but as a result of the divine purpose revealed to Abraham, etc., leading to a higher religiosity and consigning the whole idea, the whole area of sacrifice to the past. So that, this might not be surprising if you've learned about the Reform movement, that they are opposed to sacrifice and try to throw it away. And there's really an ideological component to that, because their belief system was that the rabbis, following the destruction of the temple, were reformers in a certain way. They were able to move on past a sacrificial cultic Judaism and to form a moral, ethical Judaism based on precepts. And that's what they see Judaism as. And their goal is to continue that process in 19th century Germany. So there's a very deep theological reason why they have to reject the Beis Hamikdash. But it's not just the Reform movement. What grew out of the Reform movement largely is this area of Wissenschaft, academic Jewish studies, which started in Germany in the 19th century, mostly with Reform Jews who wanted to study these things. We don't have time to go into this in detail, but Leopold Zunz had this groundbreaking article at Was über die rabbinische Literatur, a little something about rabbinic literature, and where he basically says, what happens in the yeshivot, or right when people study Gemara, they're not studying the whole corpus of Judaism. They're just studying Gemara and Halacha, and that's their goal. And they don't see Judaism as a much broader civilization with very centrally important things like stories and like discussion of different synagogue sermons. And he has a whole list. We should actually read this list of what the science of Judaism. He's purporting to be a student of the science of Judaism in a scientific way. Instead of focusing on what you want and cherry picking, he's going to look at everything, including and especially we'll see the culturally edifying things. So our science consists of different sciences, different subfields, each of them to be cultivated in its individual branches, including theology, mythology, dogmatics, religion, customs, liturgy, religious principles, rites of the synagogue, legislation, jurisprudence, writings on legal matters, comparative juridical terminology of Hebrew, Roman, and Hellenic law, knowledge and utilization of nature. This is based on a summary of his piece. And he goes on to talk about all the different areas he wants to discuss. He later wrote a book about synagogue sermons. Now, what he never ever says at any point that we need to study when we talk about rabbinic literature, something that's being missed that we need to study is what he would call sacrificial cult or something like that. A lot of focus on the synagogue, which makes sense given what his goals were. But for someone professing to be interested in the entire Jewish canon, the entire scope of rabbinic literature, he just leaves out sacrifice, which is, as I said, about a quarter of rabbinic literature. It's not even mentioned once. If he wrote a whole book about synagogue sermons, we don't really know much about that, but he never even mentioned that studying sacrifice is important. We already see a bias for someone who is professing to cover everything, that he's interested in doing what will make his religion seem more sophisticated within 19th century Germany. Of course, keeping in mind the Protestant Reformation, the move away from cult. Even we think Christianity in general moves away from cult. That's true from rituals, but the Protestant movement, we've moved even further away from the Catholic rituals. So that was the culture in Germany, and he moved to embrace it. A couple of quotes from Heinrich Gretz here, who actually was more traditional, a student of Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, and yet even Gretz, in his earlier work, he maybe said we need to think about sacrifice more seriously. In his later work, he has lines such as these in sources 7 and 8. Spiritual religion promulgated at Sinai did not intend sacrifices as the expression of divine adoration, but was meant to inculcate a moral and holy life. Sounds a lot like the Reform movement. Now, in some ways, he was drawing on the Rambam. We have that source later, but he seems to have embraced the Rambam, which is a Shitas Yachid, a minority position, not because it was a central, not because he saw it as the what the rabbi, what the Rishonim thought generally or something of the sort. Presumably he did it because he was trying to get into lockstep with his Wissenschaft brethren. And he emphasized the next source, the one of the few things he says about sacrifice in his book. And remember, it's a 5-volume, massive work. He says very few things about sacrifice in the rabbinic period. But one of the things he said is Yochanan ben Zakkai, during the rabbinic period, solves the crisis of the destroyed temple after he recognized the truth that Judaism was not indissolubly bound up with the temple and its altar. And then God prefers mercy to sacrifices, move the Sanhedrin from the temple, and moves Judaism away from the Beis HaMikdash. That's Gretz's approach. And this again is even Gretz, someone who's really comes from an Orthodox background, but in his early writing even professes seeing sacrifice as an important part of Judaism before moving away from it after being influenced by Wissenschaft. We won't read the next couple of sources inside. I'll try to summarize it outside. Jonathan Klawans has this wonderful book on sacrifice in biblical literature. But one of the things he does is he talks about why people move away from it, using the term evolutionism, the idea that religion or culture sort of evolves, gets better over time, and that's why there's a movement away from sacrifice. And there's a couple of different versions of that. One of that is the Christian version, where Jesus atones for our sins. Yeah, I also have New Testament. Ari doesn't have a monopoly on that. Right, Jesus atones for our sins. We don't need sacrifice anymore.
Marsha Kilas Yaakov.
Yeah, exactly. So the movement away from sacrifice because Jesus solves the problems. That's the Christian approach. And for many Wissenschaft scholars, there's actually a whole book on this. There's an increased emphasis in citing Rambam's Mor Nevuchim as a way of sort of getting rid of parts of Judaism they don't like, and taking the Rambam and taking it much further probably than what the Rambam himself actually meant. We can talk about what the Rambam means in Mor Nevuchim, but the source in Mor Nevuchim about how Korbanos were a way of weaning the Jewish people off of idolatry, but maybe not necessarily seen as an integral part of Judaism. That's at least one way of reading it. If you look at the Rambam Mishnah Torah and the amount of attention he gives to that, that's probably has to be complicated in certain ways. But the point by Klawans is that later scholars, whether you're Christian or whether you're Jewish, there's a sort of, for many people, there's an ideological interest in erasing the importance of sacrifice, especially the importance of sacrifice after the destruction, because you want to have this evolutionist idea. We've moved away from that. Not only do we not do it, we don't want to do it. We want to relegate it to the past, as a relic of the past. So that's by Amim Haim, that's certainly true in the 19th century. It was Manazeh. It's also true nowadays. If you look at what's out there, certainly this even exists within Judaism. You look at some what do you call them, public intellectuals, Orthodox public intellectuals, saying we need to do away with sacrifice. We don't want the Beis HaMikdash in the future. Hillel ben Sasson, who I'm told is observant, wrote an article, How the Temple Mount Obsession Could Destroy Judaism, with wonderful in its tendentiousness quote, where he says, Judaism, as the second paragraph here in source 12, Judaism as we know it developed after the destruction of the temple in 70 CE. Its very essence is alien to the notion of a functioning Jewish temple. So Judaism, in its essence, is opposed to a Beis HaMikdash. Okay, bold claim. The rabbis have thoughtfully replaced, nice that he approves, thoughtfully replaced temple sacrifice with oral prayer, priests with sages. Most important, Judaism shifted the site of divine revelation from a holy place temple to the holy text. Fine, that part is true in pragmatic sense, in a practical sense. But what we see here is there's still, among many people, probably most people, quote-unquote enlightened Western individuals have the sense that sacrifice is bad. Therefore, if I'm going to study rabbinic literature, I'll ignore the parts about sacrifice. And this has persisted more or less until the current day. And I think that, to a large degree, explains why there are so few significant studies on sacrifice in rabbinic literature, because of these ideological commitments of both the Christian and the Jewish scholars of rabbinic literature. But throughout history, there's always been, or at least since the 19th century, there's always been one major exception to this, and that is Orthodox Jews, people who actually have an ideological commitment to sacrifice. We say it 3 times a day, and people like that don't have the blind spot where they erase sacrifice as an important category. So you go back to Rav Shimshon Lefal Hirsch, certainly wrote about Korbanos very much in his commentary on Chumash. If you want to think about someone who's more academically oriented, Rav David Tzvi Hoffman, both in his commentaries on the Torah, and in his rabbinic work, his work on rabbinic literature, he has Mishnah Rishona, the first Mishnah, where he finds the different parts of Mishnah that refer to texts composed during the Beis HaMikdash period, in his opinion, and those are almost all Kudshim. That's you look at Yoma, Masechtos like that. That work was only you only can do that work if you're actually willing to look at what's there. If you actually know that there is a Bavli on Kudshim, and then actually read it and write about it. So those are a couple of examples from then. I think nowadays there's been a trend. In the last 30 years, people started asking, wait a second, why? What's the point of this rabbinic literature on sacrifice? Mishnah, Gemara, why do people talk about karbanos if it's not practical? And there was this really mental block. Like, how could there be interest in this if it wasn't being practiced at the time, right? There was no karbanos during the time of Chazal. Why would people be interested? People had different suggestions. Some people just played it down. Some people said that maybe they were thinking about messianic restoration of the temple. Some people said maybe, well, it's just Torah and you have to study it because it's Torah. Whatever the approaches have been taken, people have started, it's been about 30 years since people started thinking about this. And I think it's beginning to pay off. There are a couple of books now not about karbanos, not about sacrifice, but about the temple in different ways. Yishai Rosenzweig has a background in yeshiva, though not currently a Chovesh Kippah. Has a book on Sota ritual. Naftali Cohen, who's actually a graduate of YU, has a book on maybe YU Smicha, that is, has a book on the making of the temple, on the temple generally, and that discourse in Chazal. So I think people are slowly waking up, and people specifically with Orthodox backgrounds where Kachim was part of the canon, it wasn't somehow written off, are starting to think more about thinking about all of rabbinic literature, maybe truly fulfilling what Suntz wanted, to think about all of rabbinic literature, not to cherry pick what one's interested in. Even that Wissenschaft goal, that Wissenschaft ideal, in this case, is only being fulfilled by people with religious Orthodox backgrounds, people who take Kachim seriously. Thank you.